They sealed this site without explanation, and for decades no one asked why. At 9:42 a.m. on March 16, 1945, Corporal James Mitchell stood on the blackened slope of a volcanic ridge and watched men lower a string of demolition charges into the mouth of a cave. The engineers had already called for surrender, their voices amplified through a field loudspeaker. When silence answered, a flame licked the opening. Then a controlled detonation shoved shattered rock into the throat of the tunnel. Bulldozers pushed earth over the charred lip, and the squad moved down the trail to the next opening. Mitchell would later recall how ordinary the moment felt. They had orders. There were more caves to clear. 200 more, some reports said. And the island had to be secured. That scene has a simple, brutal clarity. In a matter of hours, a decision became a physical act. Entrance closed, passage denied, the underground cut off from fresh air and daylight. On the surface, the battle moved on. The official record ends with victory, forts secured, and lines drawn on maps. Beneath the surface, however, the story was not finished. The mouths were closed. Ropes, shells, and men were left behind. For many years afterward, the silence at those sealed thresholds was accepted, unexamined. If you want more investigative history like this, consider subscribing. There's more to uncover in places people stopped looking. To understand why those cave mouths were buried, we need to step back and see the island as both landscape and design. The Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, anticipated that a straightforward defense on the beaches would be futile against overwhelming naval and aerial firepower. Instead, he turned the island's geology into a weapon. Layers of volcanic ash and porous rock could be carved into a defense in depth. Interlinked tunnels, concealed firing positions, and a network built to sustain a long, attritional fight. Kuribayashi's orders favored concealment, mobility, and the transfer of command underground. The aim was not to die on the sand, but to convert the entire island into a fortress that would force the invader to bleed. Allied planners expected a different kind of resistance. Heavy bombardment was supposed to neutralize defenses before landings. Yet what came ashore in February and March of 1945 was a landscape that absorbed cannon and bomb alike, and yielded fewer enemy bodies than tactical logic suggested. Men who might otherwise have been found on the surface were operating from below. When conflict concentrated on denying the shore, the defenders slipped beneath it. The American response on each encountered cave followed a pattern that, in the conditions of the day, made grim operational sense. First, a demand to surrender. Second, a conspicuous show of incendiary force. Flamethrowers became a favored tool against interior positions, designed to flush or kill defenders without exposing assaulting troops to ambush inside dark passages. Third, demolition charges to collapse and close openings. And finally, when blocks remained or when speed mattered, bulldozers pushed soil and rock over the sealed mouths to deny re-entry. Combat engineers who faced narrow, labyrinthine passages could not safely clear every chamber. The risk of booby traps, close-quarter ambushes, and structurally weakened ceilings made prolonged interior operations costly and unpredictable. These field decisions were tactical answers to immediate problems: protect the living men outside the caves, maintain momentum, and prevent the enemy from using interior positions to cut supply and advance lines. They were not, on their face, policies aimed at erasing people. Yet the architectural reality of the tunnel systems complicates the story. What the Americans often encountered were not single rooms but an engineered subsurface fortress. Hand-carved galleries that ran for kilometers, vertical shafts that brought in air, niches for supplies, rooms arranged to serve as mess halls or small infirmaries, and larger chambers intended for command and control. Modern explorations, careful, limited, and often carried out decades after the battle, have revealed a scale and complexity that surprised many historians. Footage taken inside surviving sections shows smooth tunnel walls marked by repeated tooling, bolt holes drilled into stone for shelves or supports, low-arched ceilings shaped to deflect blast, and ventilation shafts bored to link deep galleries with the surface. Measurements taken by researchers and museum teams estimate a tunnel network, running roughly 18 kilometers in total length across several connected systems on the island. Within that network, researchers described chambers large enough to hold dozens of men, narrow crawlways intended for stealthy movement, and what appears to have been improvised medical spaces. Small stone benches, niches could be read as storage for bandages and bottles, and places where the wounded might be tended out of sight. Those details create a disquieting implication. When a mouth was sealed, by flame, charge, and then by earth, ventilation was disrupted. A closed entrance could cut off the final path for fresh air into a section of the tunnel. Even if those inside had prepared for siege conditions and brought respiration supplies or stoves, underground life depended on airflow. Blocked shafts and buried mouthpieces could transform a survivable defense into an untenable trap over days or weeks. Exploration footage from later investigations sometimes shows deliberate interior blockages, piles of stacked rock wedged into passageways, and tool marks inconsistent with original construction, as if someone had attempted to dig outward. These signs can suggest two possibilities: that occupants tried to escape and were prevented, or that later occupants attempted to reopen sealed passages and failed. Archaeological evidence can be persuasive without being conclusive. Bolt hole patterns suggest the presence of shelving and organized storage. The placement of command rooms near multiple exits indicates planning for movement. The existence of narrow air shafts shows that Kurobayashi's engineers anticipated long-term occupation. But these facts leave open critical uncertainties. How many people occupied these networks when the Americans sealed them? How many chambers were truly closed in a way that prevented air renewal? And how many people, if any, remained trapped after the immediate fighting moved on? There are no comprehensive contemporaneous inventories that answer those questions definitively. There are, however, human stories that complicate the tidy official closure. Long after the island was declared secure, isolated Japanese soldiers continued to emerge from hiding. Reports recorded men coming forward months and even years after the war, the most widely cited case being a soldier who reportedly emerged in 1949 and was found weighing 89 pounds. Testimonies from these survivors describe long, desperate periods underground, scrounging food from caches and relying on candlelight and sheer endurance. These accounts are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, the passage of time and the trauma of combat cloud memory. Still, they provide concrete proof that subterranean life continued to be possible, and that not all defenders died or surrendered at the moment the sealing took place. On the American side, men like Corporal Mitchell carried memories that threaded into the island's later moral geography. The soldier who watched charges explode into a cave mouth would later be troubled not necessarily by victory, but by the thought of what might remain in the dark. Veterans' recollections often blend procedural acceptance and deep unease. For those who had seen the engineering of the tunnels and then witnessed their closure, a recurring question lingered. Had immediate tactical necessity overridden the possibility of later accountability or recovery? That question is as much about the psychological cost of war as it is about physical remains. Why then did post-war authorities not mount systematic excavations of those sealed spaces? The answers are multiple and avoid easy moral caricature. First, there were practical constraints. Excavation is expensive in manpower, time, and resources. The larger post-war priorities, reconstruction, repatriation, and political realignment, pushed battlefield archaeology down the list. Second, the risk to living investigators was real. Many tunnels were structurally compromised and contaminated with unexploded ordnance. Sending teams into uncertain underground spaces presented hazards that governments and museums were often unwilling to accept without clear justification. Third, cultural and ethical considerations played a role. For some Japanese authorities and families, the idea of opening burial sites was an affront to the dead. In other contexts, it might have been seen as a necessary act of closure. Those positions could clash, complicating international cooperation. Institutions such as museums and national defense agencies have navigated these tensions differently. The National Museum of the Pacific War and other historical bodies have pushed for careful documentation and limited exploration, balancing research with respect. Museum analysis has suggested that material evidence inside tunnels, tool marks, bolt holes, remnants of supply stores, is informative enough to reconstruct many aspects of underground life without necessarily undertaking mass excavation. For some scholars and families, documenting the architecture and testimony suffices. For others, the moral demand is for physical recovery and identification of remains. The calculus of choice is further tangled by politics. Post-war Japan faced profound transformation. The occupying powers and newly formed governments had to negotiate responsibility, sovereignty, and commemoration. In that volatile landscape, decisions about who's dead to exhume and when could touch raw nerves and create diplomatic complications. Moreover, on islands with significant ecological sensitivity and evolving civilian use, large-scale excavation risked environmental damage and disruption to living communities. These pragmatic considerations, cost, risk, respect, and political consequence, offer plausible reasons for the broad reluctance to revisit sealed sections. Still, the absence of a full-scale coordinated inquiry sustains the core unease. What exactly did those bulldozers bury? Exploration footage and museum research do not simply confirm that tunnels existed. They suggest the tunnels were built for endurance. Where endurance meets closure, the ethics become knotty. If a sealed passage cut off air, did the sealing action accelerate deaths that might otherwise have been delayed? Or did it prevent further casualties among attacking forces by denying a lethal hiding place for defenders who could have continued to inflict destruction? Both claims can be argued with evidence and with empathy. Neither provides moral absolutes. Part of the unresolved question also lies in record-keeping. Wartime after-action reports focused on mission outcomes, not on detailed inventories of interior occupants. Engineering notes recorded methods, materials, and technical recommendations. They did not necessarily record how many people were inside each chamber at the moment of sealing. Over time, natural erosion, later construction, and drift of documentary attention have created gaps. Researchers piecing together the physical record must therefore rely on a triangulation of evidence: survivor testimony, archaeological traces, contemporary photographs, and the tactical logic of the period. The site's material record offers compelling, if silent, testimony. In one visited cave now identified on maps as Hill 3622A, footage shows a shallow alcove with bolt holes spaced at regular intervals. A narrow corridor extends into rock before turning. In another interior chamber labeled by researchers as a field command post, a series of shelves and small carved benches suggest administrative life underground. Maps folded on stone, ration tins stacked in a corner, a crude tabletop fixed to the wall. In several sites, investigators have documented stacked material shoved against passageways, as if occupants or later visitors attempted to block or control movement within. None of this proves a particular fate for the people who used those spaces. But it does indicate intention and sustained occupation. The creation of environments meant for life, planning, and survival. The human consequences of those architectural decisions are not purely speculative. Reports indicate that the Allied sealing strategy produced a residue of unknowns: individuals who surrendered weeks later, others who emerged famished months after the island was declared secure, and almost certainly numbers who never came back out. The precise count of those who may have been trapped remains unknowable in the absence of systematic excavation and forensic inquiry. Here the historian must be careful. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We must also avoid asserting a single narrative that simplifies complex choices made under fire. In that sense, the question implied by the title, "Why was the site sealed without explanation and why did no one ask why?" becomes less an accusation and more an indictment of forgetfulness and of practical limits. Wartime decisions were taken to save lives, preserve momentum, and reduce risk. Post-war choices were made within a matrix of resources, danger, and differing cultural priorities. Yet the moral and human question remains. When does tactical expedience become a moral blind spot? When does the failure to inquire about what was buried become a form of forgetting that impoverishes collective memory? For veterans like Mitchell, the silence could be corrosive. Men who had watched entrances sealed carried the image of dark mouths and swallowed light. Some would never speak of it. Others would ask late in life whether more could have been done. Psychologists studying combat stress note that unresolved moral dilemmas, what contemporary scholars call moral injury, can afflict veterans as much as direct trauma. The sense of having been party to a procedure whose outcomes are unresolved can haunt men long after medals and citations are archived. On the other hand, the respect for the dead is also a moral claim. Exhumation and excavation are intrusive acts that can violate cultural taboos and reopen family wounds. For many communities, laying the dead to rest without disturbance is itself a form of dignity. The competing moral imperatives, inquiry and recovery on the one hand, respect and sanctity on the other, resist a neat resolution. That complexity helps explain why, in many cases, no single authority ever felt empowered to mount a full-scale excavation that would answer the outstanding questions. Still, time and technology change possibility. Non-invasive surveying techniques, improved forensic methods, and international collaboration have made certain forms of investigation less disruptive and more ethical. Where institutions have chosen to engage, limited digs, laser scanning of interiors, careful documentation, new knowledge has emerged without reckless disturbance. Those projects are, however, piecemeal and dependent on funding, legal permissions, and local consent. So we are left with a layered fact. The site was sealed. The sealing was practice, not mystery at the time, a field expedient among many during a brutal campaign. But the larger arc of responsibility, to the dead, to survivors, and to historical truth, was not completed. Modern exploration shows an engineered underground world that could have sustained human life for significant periods, which means the stakes of sealing were high. Survivors who emerged later prove the network's capacity for endurance. The lack of large-scale excavation leaves open a human tally we can only estimate, not determine. How many remain sealed beneath that blackened slope? Counts vary, but what is clear is that a number of tunnel mouths were deliberately closed and never systematically reopened. The uncertainty itself is part of the legacy, a landscape of unanswered questions that demands humility from historians and compassion from citizens. The ethical invitation, perhaps, is simple. To confront a sealed site is not only an exercise in forensic curiosity, it is a moral choice about how societies remember and how they honor those affected by war. Inquiry need not be an act of desecration. It can be an act of remembrance. Documentation, respectful limited excavation when consented to, and the careful preservation of testimony all offer ways to answer some of the outstanding questions without trampling dignity. We can close then on what the title insists upon. They sealed this site without explanation. And for decades too few asked why. That silence has weight. It holds the shape of human decisions made under pressure, and the quieter decisions made by later generations who chose other priorities. It holds the possibility that somewhere beneath an island of black rock and salt wind, small rooms carved by men still keep the trace of their lives. If this story moved you, share it with someone who cares about the complexities of memory and history, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from or what surprised you most. Whatever the next step, careful research, respectful memorials, or quiet reflection, begins with a refusal to let those sealed mouths remain merely background to victory. We owe the living the truth, and we owe the dead our careful attention.